Thank you for that gracious introduction. And I want to thank Jamie for putting this together and really inviting me out here to speak to all of you tonight. And thanks for everybody for coming. It's an impressive crowd. I've spoken at about, I don't know, maybe 20 universities in different forms. And this is the largest crowd that I've seen turn out for an event. So it's quite flattering. Let me start off with a question, which is, how many interrogators do we have in the audience? Show of hands. Okay. I should have seen every hand go up. When I came back from the war, I was walking through Target, and I was going past the toy aisle. There was a young boy, and he walked up to his father and said, "Father, can I have this toy?" And his father said, "No, you can't." And he immediately turned and walked over to his mother and said, "Mom, I know you love me more. Can I have this toy?" That was when I realized we're all born interrogators, because what interrogation really is it's just questioning. It's negotiation, it's compromise, it's a little bit of psychology, it's a little bit of sales. But we all interrogate every day. I want to start off also with a story from Iraq to kind of give you an idea of what it's like to be there and to be an interrogator. And the reason I really like to try and tell stories, true stories, and why I decided to write the book in the first place and speak out is because when I came back from Iraq, and I came back in late 2006, and then the presidential race obviously was kicking off. Not too long after that, people started to discuss the issue of torture. And what I found is that the large majority of voices, overwhelming majority of voices, who were verbalizing opinions about interrogations had never done an interrogation. And that they were basing their opinions from people who had never done an interrogation. And what we needed was interrogators in the debate. So let me put you in Iraq when I was there. I arrived in Iraq in March of 2006. It was exactly 1 month after the Golden Dome mosque bombing, which essentially set off a civil war between Sunni and Shia in Iraq. It was the height of the violence. Suicide bombings were pretty much a daily occurrence. It certainly felt like the entire country was erupting around us. And late in my tour, the last month of my tour, I was sent to join a raid team, which is a team of special forces soldiers who would go out and conduct killer capture missions to try and find the people behind the suicide bombings that was plunging Iraq into this civil war. And so I was attached to this team, and every day for an entire month, I went out on a mission with this team. And they would capture somebody, and then I would interrogate them at the point of capture in their house, a street, a car, to determine whether or not they're the right person, if they're involved with Al-Qaeda or with an insurgent activity, and then to get our next target. And there was a lot of pressure to do this very quickly, because when you capture somebody, and let's say they are a member of a terrorist cell, if you don't get your next target fairly quickly, I'd say within a couple of hours, word's going to get out and the next target will move. So there was a lot of pressure to deliver results. There was a lot of pressure to find the men behind the suicide bombings and stop them, and the cost was in lives. And so there was basically a lot of pressure. I landed in a northern city in Iraq to join this raid team, and within an hour of landing, I was in the back of a Stryker, which is a military vehicle, going out the gate to conduct the first mission. We went to this house. We were looking for these two twin brothers who were part of an Al-Qaeda cell that was involved in suicide bombing operations. And we went to the house, and the soldiers raided it, and they captured the twin brothers, and they called me in along with my interrogations partner, a guy named Mike, who'd been a street cop in Dallas prior to becoming an interrogator. And we came in with our two interpreters, who were Iraqis, Iraqi Americans. We took these two twin brothers, and we put them in separate rooms, and we started off with just some basic questioning. What's your job? Who lives in this house? What is the name of your relatives? Just to get some background information. And then we reconvened and we compared our notes, and they were similar. So there wasn't any discrepancies between the twin brothers. But we're fairly certain, because of the descriptions and because of the intelligence we had, that these guys were the right guys. I mean, how often would you raid a house with twin brothers on accident, if that's the people you're looking for. But we were trying to figure out how are we going to get the next target, their boss, who's the guy we were really looking for. How are we going to find out his location? So we decided to do something that every street cop or detective can tell you about. It's called Prisoner's Dilemma. And how many people here watch Law & Order? NCIS, CSI, I can go on, Criminal Minds. You've probably seen this. We go back to both guys and we say, hey, look, your brother told us. He said that the guy we're looking for lives 2 streets over. Now, I went to the older brother, and the older brother, when I told him this, said to me, I don't know what you're talking about. But what do you think the younger brother said? The younger brother said, you're wrong, he doesn't live 2 streets over, he lives 3 streets over. Now, why did he decide to talk in that situation? It's a non-coercive interrogation. It's basically a ruse that we're using. We inserted a false narrative that was based on an assumption. But we were also playing on our knowledge of the culture. And what I mean by that is that in Iraq and in the Middle East, there's a hierarchical culture in which relationships between siblings are considerably larger in terms of age than they are here in the United States. So it'd be very rare for a younger brother to contradict his older brother. And so the younger brother was very afraid of saying something that would be against what he believed his older brother had just said. But he wanted to correct it, but not refute it. And so the technique was effective. And if you come here in the United States and you talk to any detective out here on the street, they'll tell you about this technique. They use it all the time. But Army intelligence interrogators are not taught this technique. Why not? There's no good reason. It's non-coercive, and it's effective, but they're not taught it simply because we've erected an artificial barrier between law enforcement techniques and Army intelligence interrogation techniques. And the reason why is purely bureaucratic. Some people will say, well, intelligence interrogators aren't out to get a confession. They're out to get intelligence. That might be true, but the object of the technique is not to get a confession, it's to get cooperation. I'm going to take the argument about torture for a second and turn it on its head. Let's act like we're not talking about interrogators. Okay? Let's say we're talking about the infantry. And let's say we're at the beginning of the ground war in Iraq. U.S. forces are moving up towards Baghdad, and during the actual ground invasion, they met significant resistance at the Karbala Pass. They got bogged down, they got delayed. Let's say the infantry commander on the ground there had come back to his commanding general and said, sir, we've met extremely difficult resistance, we can't push through. I'm requesting permission to use chemical weapons. Now, chemical weapons are illegal. I don't think anybody's going to argue that they would be either legal, ethical, but we would say they're extremely effective. What do you think the commanding general would have said to this infantryman? I think he would have said, you're crazy and you're fired. Go home. Yet with interrogators, when they meet resistance, or if they fail, which they do, like every profession does, the reaction is that they need something that's illegal to be able to do their jobs. And that it's okay because we're talking about interrogations, as if it's this mystery of a profession. The truth is that professional interrogators don't need torture, and we've never felt like we needed torture. And that goes for both law enforcement and professional military interrogators. Now, I won't say that there aren't some interrogators who have believed otherwise, but the large majority of interrogators who are experienced and professional will tell you that they've never requested to use enhanced interrogation techniques. Why is that? It's because it's not our tradition. Now, you can find instances of detainee abuse in the United States military, but it's never been the United States military's position, not since George Washington and the Revolutionary War, to mistreat detainees. George Washington said that we could not abuse detainees, even at the point when they're at Valley Forge, and it looked like the war was lost. And his argument was that if we use torture, we'll become the very thing that we're fighting against. That tradition continued through the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln. In World War II, we didn't use torture or mistreat detainees. In fact, in the Pacific, against Japanese prisoners of war, the most famous or legendary American interrogator was a Marine named Sherwood Moran. And Moran had been a missionary in Japan for 20 years before the war. And he joined the Marines at age 50, became an interrogator, and went to interrogate Japanese POWs. And the techniques that he used, in his own words, he said that an interrogator has to be a real wooer. That's not the word I would have used, but his point was that if you know the culture and you can endear yourself to someone, if you can show them compassion, if you can get to know them, you can convince them to cooperate. And that's what began our tradition of what we call rapport-building techniques in the military. And he wrote a guide when he came home that became the basis of today's Army Field Manual on interrogations. And that same thing happened in the European theater. There were guys that were at a secret fort hunt that was in Northern Virginia, and they interrogated high-ranking Nazi captures, and they used these really awful things to convince Germans to talk, and that's cigarettes and games of chess. Now, for some people, chess might be torture, and it was extremely effective. The most effective interrogator we had in Vietnam or in DeForest used rapport-building techniques and a detailed database. The Germans in World War II, probably the most effective interrogator in the entire war was a guy named Hans Scharf, who interrogated for the German Luftwaffe, or the Air Force. And he used rapport-building techniques and a detailed database, which is similar. The detailed database, it just supports an evidence-based approach, which is a law enforcement technique. And so we see these techniques being successful again and again. The capture of Saddam was made possible by using non-coercive techniques by an interrogator named Eric Maddox in the Army. Jose Padilla, the dirty bomber, was found from the interrogations of Abu Zubaydah by Ali Soufan using law enforcement techniques and rapport building. And my team found, located, and facilitated the killing of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, by using non-coercive techniques. So if interrogation techniques that are non-coercive have such a long history of success, and it's in the Army Field Manual why we shouldn't use torture, what changed after 9/11? And why did we begin using what are called enhanced interrogation techniques? I want to hear some audience interaction on this. Somebody, give me an answer, maybe 1 or 2 words or sentence of why we used torture. What?
We became fearful.
Okay, fear. Here's the number one thing I hear most often is fear. I'm going to talk about that. Anybody else? Some short 1 or 2 words?
Revenge. Well, Dick Cheney was hoping to produce false information.
Okay, revenge, false information. Okay, I'm going to address all of these. What is this? Sadism, okay.
Anger.
And anger, okay. Let's stop there because I only have an hour. Okay. Let me talk first about fear. Is fear bad? If you're walking through a jungle somewhere and there's a lot of wildlife in the area and the blades of grass move and you're not sure if it's the wind or a tiger, is fear a good thing in that situation? Yeah, it alerts your senses, it tells you. I believe, and this is my opinion, fear is a symptom. I'm not fearful of this cup of water. You're fearful of things that are different. And I think that fear is the symptom and the cause is prejudice. Okay, and I'm going to tell you a little bit later why I think that's true. Revenge, I would say yes, that's part of it, without a doubt. I think some people who are inexperienced, had never completed an interrogation, believed that interrogations were a means of punishment. And you can still hear that in the language today. When you hear people say that we need to weaken somebody's defenses to get them to cooperate, weaken people's defenses physically or mentally in no way convinces them to cooperate. That's based on revenge. To get false info, well, we know from the interrogations of Abu Zubaydah that the guy that we were originally told was the highest capture we had made, who was a key lieutenant of Osama bin Laden, and he was the first person to be waterboarded. We now know that Abu Zubaydah wasn't even in Al-Qaeda. He was basically a travel agent. Yet when he told them that he didn't know these things, the answers to the questions they were asking him, and they continued to waterboard him, they didn't believe him. And the reason they didn't believe him is because they're operating on the false assumption that coercion gets you the truth. Coercion doesn't get you the truth. Coercion gets you the minimum amount of information that a detainee has to give you to make pain stop. And that could be true or not. It could just be what you want to hear. The other problem with coercion and torture is you're shooting for the absolute minimum. Now, how many people here, some students might not agree with me, how many people shoot for the bare minimum on an exam? Okay, well, I can tell you as a soldier, there is nothing I do where I shoot for the bare minimum, especially in war, especially when people's lives are on the line, especially when I need accurate, timely intelligence information that could save people's lives. The last thing I want is the minimum. I want the maximum. Sadism. Before I was an interrogator, I was a criminal investigator. I did that for almost 9 years for the Air Force. I can tell you in every population there's a criminal population. And some of it, without a doubt, is just basic criminal behavior. It's sadism. I personally believe that I'm very concerned about the number of people, okay? Because the abuse was so widespread. How widespread was it? We don't know, because we've never had a fully encompassing investigation or inquiry that would tell us how many people it was. The closest we can come is in May of 2006, the FBI released an Inspector General report that looked at all the instances in which FBI agents had witnessed torture and abuse. And they asked all their agents, and they reported back there was 173 cases of torture and abuse witnessed by FBI agents just at Guantanamo Bay. Now consider that FBI agents are only present for 3%, maybe 5% of all interrogations. There's another, I believe, 70 some odd cases between Iraq and Afghanistan. You extrapolate that number, and there's no doubt in my mind there's been thousands of cases of detainee abuse. I mean, there's been over 300 just investigations up to 2006. There's been over 100 deaths of detainees. By some estimates, at least half of those were homicides. There is criminal behavior. Anger. Where did the anger stem from? It stemmed from the frustration of not being able to get accurate and timely intelligence information. And this comes from some of the very early interrogators who worked in Afghanistan on the ground. They went in there, they used the techniques that they were trained on to fight the Cold War, which are the same techniques out of the Army Field Manual that we used in Vietnam that have worked successfully in the Panama invasion and the first Gulf War. And the techniques didn't work. Why is that? Anyone want to guess? Culture. There we go. Culture. I would argue it's because we did not understand the culture and we did not adapt our techniques for the culture. I'm going to give you 3 reasons, in my opinion, why we ended up with torture and abuse. The first is ignorance and incompetence. The idea that everybody can be made to talk and the expectation that interrogators can be successful 100% of the time. There's no profession that's successful 100% of the time. And also the ignorance or the incompetence in thinking that people who didn't even have information could be made to give it by assuming that they were people they weren't. We now know that the people who were called the worst of the worst that were sent to Guantanamo Bay, of all the detainees there, I think the statistic is that 3 or 5% of them were captured by U.S. forces. That's it, 3 or 5%. The rest were turned in by either northern forces or Pakistanis or someone else. And the large majority of them were turned in during a period when we were paying very high bounties for captures. I also would call this not just negligence, but criminal negligence. And the reason I say that, let me give you the background. When I was in Iraq, I oversaw a lot of interrogations of foreign fighters. People who come from outside Iraq to fight. And the number one reason they gave for coming to Iraq to fight, by far, was because of torture and abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. The policy of torture and abuse recruited, Al-Qaeda used that as its number one recruiting tool. And it brought thousands of foreign fighters to Iraq who then killed American soldiers. Hundreds, probably thousands of American soldiers. This wasn't a big surprise. People act now like, oh, this recruiting mantra, we didn't see that coming. Who would have known? Really? Like, we didn't know that our own morale improved when we found out that our own POWs have been mistreated in past wars? All you have to do is open the Army Field Manual. And in there, it tells you the negative impacts that will result of torturing or abusing or treating detainees inhumanely. In fact, it's been in the Army Field Manual since at least 1949. So this isn't what I call negligence, this is what I call criminal negligence, which is to have the information and to ignore it. There was also, and continues to be, a deliberate ignoring of the long-term consequences of detainee abuse. When you look at the arguments that people make, those who support torture, ask yourself how many times they address the long-term consequences. They'll say, it saved lives, it was effective. But they'll never talk about the long-term recruitment of future detainees, losing the hearts and minds of otherwise moderate Muslims. They'll never talk about the fact that some of our allies have refused to do operations with us because they don't want us handling the detainees who are captured from those operations. They won't talk about the numerous Iraqis who abandoned high-ranking religious and social leaders, tribal sheikhs who abandoned U.S. forces in Iraq when they learned of Abu Ghraib and refused to work with us. They won't talk about the fact that in a future war, U.S. troops will now be subject to torture, based on the same rationales that they used to say that we could torture people now. They refused to talk about the fact that in the first Gulf War, huge portions of the Iraqi army surrendered to U.S. troops because they knew that they'd be treated well in custody. We can forget about that happening anytime in the near future. And so there's all these secondary effects of using torture and abuse that are never addressed by those people who support or advocate for it. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the failure of leadership or emotional immaturity. How many times have you heard senior leaders in our government say that in the panic after 9/11 and not knowing that another attack was coming, you had to know what it was like to be there? Anybody ever heard that? Okay, I've heard it from the Director of National Intelligence, I've heard it from the Secretary of State, I've heard it from the Vice President, former Vice President, and numerous other supporters of the policy of torture and abuse. I'm not sure about everyone else's opinion, but my opinion is that you elect leaders and we appoint people to positions of leadership for exactly that reason, to step away from their emotions during times of crisis and to perform their professional duty. This is something called emotional maturity. It's not a new subject, but it's something we fail to do. General George C. Marshall, who was the commander in Europe during World War II, once said that once war begins, in every man there arises a beast who begins tugging on its chains. And it's the officer's responsibility to keep that beast on its chains in himself and in his men. And this is exactly what he was talking about. Imagine, okay, just imagine for a second what it was like to be an interrogator, to capture somebody, to take out of their home CDs, videos, watch those videos, and watch the person that you just captured cut somebody's head off with a machete, and then to walk into the interrogation booth and interrogate that person. Can you imagine the amount of emotional anger that you have inside when you watch that type of act, and then you have to go in and interrogate this person? That takes an extraordinary amount of professionalism to stand back from your emotions and to do what's right. If our leaders can't do that, can we expect 19, 20, 21-year-old interrogators to do that? And this gets to the issue that I think Amnesty has been a leader on, which is accountability and why it's so important. It's important because, as Darius Rajali, a friend of mine and a professor, says, when you don't hold people accountable for torture, you're sure to repeat it. Absolutely, and the evidence shows that time and time throughout history. Right now, in the United States, the decision about torture is a policy decision. When President Obama took the Nobel Peace Prize, he said that he prohibited torture. The president can no more prohibit torture than he can prohibit murder. You can't prohibit a crime. We have the law, and the law prohibits the crime. But now it's a policy decision, a decision that can be reversed. If next election goes another way, we could be back to torture. I think, personally, we could be back to torture with just another terrorist attack. And if you look at some of the debates that have happened since the Times Square plot and the Christmas Day airliner, I think we could be back to torture very quickly. But the last thing I'm going to argue about why we resorted to torture, why we went to torture, is because of prejudice, what I call the dirty P word. Nobody getting funny ideas. This is something that you'll rarely ever hear people talk about in this debate, and it just completely baffles me that we won't put the cards on the table and talk about them. How many times have we discussed altering Miranda rights when a white supremacist attempts to conduct a terrorist attack against the United States? I can tell you, when I was an interrogator, I was the only interrogator I ever met who'd read the Quran. This is the book that our enemy reads and knows by heart. And yet we're so averse to this religion that we won't even pick up the book and read a chapter to understand it. It's not like you get to the last chapter and you flip the page and you're, poof, converted, you know? You know what the book people were reading when I was going through training, some of the students and instructors? The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam. I mean, this would be like reading the Mein Kampf to understand Christianity. There is a significant amount of prejudice against Muslims and Arabs in this country, I believe, and in the Interrogator Corps and in the military. I think it's changing and it's getting better, but I think this was a key factor, a cause, not a symptom, that led us to torture and abuse detainees. And I heard it all the time. It started with name-calling like raghead, jihadi, haji, which is exactly what they told us in training not to do. Because they said, don't use names because that demonizes people, it strips them of their humanity, and that's the first step towards abuse. Yet when I got to Iraq, I was shocked at how many people were using those types of derogatory terms. You know how many Muslim interrogators I met on active duty? 0. 0. There may be one. I'm not saying there's not. I've never met one. I've never heard of one. Compare that to World War II, where almost 99% of our interrogators were Japanese Americans. Do you think that has something to do with influencing the attitudes of soldiers towards our detainees? Without a doubt. How many people here have watched 24? Okay, I'm glad we have honest people. Now, 24 factor is one that's talked about a lot. I've been to the set of 24, and I talked to the executive producers and the writers before the last season, and I told them why torture is not effective. I gave them some scenes of true stories like the one I just told you. And what do you think happened in the next season after we went there? And it was not just me, but I also went with the interrogator who found Saddam Hussein. What happened? More torture. In fact, the torture got worse on the show. And the reason why is because, and this is my personal opinion, I think they truly believe in it. And I think they believe in it for a variety of factors, all of which we've talked about here tonight. But none of them are professional interrogators. But the problem is that if you look at the statistics of the number of times, and not just torture has been shown on TV, but the number of times that it's been shown to be effective, it's gone from something like 0 or 1 or 2 prior to 9/11 to 226 times in 2006. It's become, I think, an accepted part of our society. When we have Supreme Court justices and politicians, senators, and other experts saying that they wish they had more Jack Bauers to fight terrorism, you really have to ask yourself, like, what world are they living in? Yeah? Because if you're going to pick a fictional character, why pick Jack Bauer? Pick Superman, right? I mean, as long as we're living in a fantasy. How many people here have heard about the ticking time bomb scenario? Okay. Does anybody know where that originates, by chance?
Fox News?
Fox News. Okay. Let me say two things. The scenario that we're told doesn't exist. In fact, Darius Rejali, again, who did the research, found that it came from a French novel written about, called The Centurions, written about the French experience in Algeria. But let me tell you what is a ticking time bomb scenario. Every time I interrogated somebody in Iraq. Why? Because almost everybody I interrogated had some information that could have saved lives. Now, how many lives is considered a ticking time bomb scenario? Anybody know? Is it 2 or 6 or 12 or 100 or a city from a nuclear weapon? I don't know. And how would I ever know that that person is the only person with that information? If you can find one person with all the information, wow, you know, that would be the day, because it never happens. The ticking time bomb scenario, as we're told it, is a myth. What I can tell you is there are people who we capture who have information that if we could get quicker, we could save lives. But the way to get that information quicker is by using rapport-based techniques or law enforcement techniques, not by using torture. And yet we're presented this false narrative that we either have to choose keeping ourselves safe or torture. Now, I'm the first person to tell you that you can't say torture never works, because every technique works on somebody. I guarantee you there's somebody in the world who, if I walk in and hand them a piece of bubble gum, they're going to tell me everything they got in their brain. But we're talking about probabilities. And the technique that's least likely to work at the bottom of that scale of probabilities is torture. For all the reasons we discussed. And people will tell you what they think you want to know. They'll say whatever they think they have to say to stop the pain. And I didn't even talk about proven social phenomena or psychological phenomena like the effect of stress on memory. So where do we go from here? If we're not going to use torture, what should we do? Should we just go back to the Army Field Manual, what we've been doing for the last 50 years? Well, I don't think that's the answer either. Interrogations isn't a static science. It's something that can be advanced and improved. At some point, we came up with these methods that work fairly well, most of them. Why can't we get even more methods? Why can't we add to them? We can. And that's what I say is a little bit different about what my team did in Iraq that other people haven't done, is we took techniques from law enforcement that cops use every day here in America to solve cases, and we combined them with the techniques in the Army Field Manual, and we tailored it for the culture. And I would guess, you know, just a rough guesstimate, that probably 80% of our detainees cooperated in some form or fashion. We have the ability to advance our techniques. Where would we get them? Anybody here ever bought a car? Come on, some people. Okay, when you're at the dealership and you're sitting down with that very honest salesman, the one that never lies, and you're sitting across from him, and you got down to that last couple $100, or you wanted the fancy stereo or something, I don't know, the neon lights underneath, and you couldn't agree on that. Did he pick up the phone and say, let me call my boss, he has the authority to do this, and I don't? Anybody ever experienced that, buying anything? It happened to me, no kidding, 2 weeks ago when I was trying to negotiate a sales contract or a rental contract for my mother in a condo, and the salesman said, I wanted one of the fees to be waived, and he said, well, let me call my boss. And I was like, I'm an interrogator. You're going to pull that technique on me? This comes from compliance theory. There's a book that was written 15 years ago called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Dr. Robert Cialdini that talked about the 6 principles of compliance that people in marketing and sales and advertising use every day to get you to buy something. You know those silly infomercials where they have the guy who's not even a doctor, but he plays a doctor on TV? Why do people buy those products from a guy who's not even a doctor? Because of something called authority. Why can't we use those same techniques? Well, we did. I took that same boss introduction technique and used it in Iraq. In fact, we had a young guy that we caught that was basically Al-Qaeda's web developer. And one of my interrogators built very good rapport with him, but couldn't convince him to give us information. And she walked in one day and she said to him, hey, look, you know what? I don't think I can get you what you're asking for or what would convince you to cooperate with us, but my boss can. Let me bring him in here. But before he comes in here, let me warn you, like, please, 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 don't make me lose face. Anybody ever heard about losing face before in other cultures? Please don't make me lose face in front of my boss. I could get fired. Okay, you can't really get fired as an interrogator. That was a lie, obviously. And so she said, I'm going to bring my boss in, so don't disappoint me. Don't get me in trouble. So I'm walking down the hall, and I grab a piece of scrap paper out of the garbage can, and I walk in an interrogation room, and I act very official, and I'm like, is this your name? Check. Is this where you're from? Check. So let me just be honest with you. I have the ability to help you out, but I'm not sure why I should do that unless you do something first. And the guy kind of thought about it for a second, and he looked to my young female interrogator. She gave him just the most compassionate look, like, it's okay. Which is an advantage I'm going to tell you about female interrogators that males can't do. And he turned and he said, okay, I'll work with you. I design Al-Qaeda's web pages. Oh, and my boss is this guy. His name's Abu Raja. Well, guess what? Abu Raja was sitting in the cell next to him in the next interrogation booth. We'd been interrogating him for 2 weeks and couldn't figure out where he fit in the puzzle. He was Al-Qaeda's media guy for all of Iraq. And we solved it because we adopted a technique that car salesmen use. But we don't teach it to our Army interrogators. We can advance our methods. We have the perfect raw material right now in the next generation of Americans from which to mold interrogators. Why? How many people here Facebook? That was almost everybody. Okay. Al-Qaeda is organized like Facebook. It's not traditional rank and file army. It's based on social networking. You know, if you have a cousin, Vinny, over in Ramadi, and he knows how to get some weapons, and oh, by the way, on your way, stop by Fallujah and pick up some bomb-making equipment and drop this money off. That's the way it works. It's all about social relationships, tribe relationships. There's no Al-Qaeda recruiting office where you go up one day and sign a piece of paper, I'll go for 5 years and I want to be in logistics. It's organized exactly like Facebook. And this next generation of Americans, they get that. They understand the way that they're organized intrinsically. The second reason is because of globalization and the internet. So young people today are more likely to understand other cultures. Is the bottom line. They can probably tell you what Ramadan is. They could probably tell you a heck of a lot more than my parents could or my grandparents about Islam or about any other culture. And so they're more culturally aware and attuned. And the last thing, how many people here watch reality TV? I always get a lot less hands in that than Facebook for some reason. Okay, so I can triple that number because I know that most people won't admit it. What is the appeal of reality TV? Anyone? Drama. Because of the drama, because of the raw emotions. All right? Don't we always like to say that? The damn kids these days, so full of drama. Well, this young generation gets that. They get the power of emotions, and they're not afraid to express them. Not only that, but they know how to trigger them in other people. I mean, watch Real World. You want to see people push each other's buttons? They know exactly how to do that. And what's your most powerful tool in an interrogation? Emotions. I say that in the interrogation booth, emotions rage like wildfires. You know, I have this technique. It's called the Van Gogh that one of my instructors taught me. It's like Van Gogh, the painter, the Dutch painter. And the idea is to paint a picture in the mind of the detainee of what the future would look like if he cooperated and you worked together. And so you have them close their eyes and you paint this picture I used to talk about. Imagine the future 5, 10 years from now. Iraq is safe, secure. I come back with my family to visit Babylon. Disney World's is boring at this point, so now we're coming to Iraq. And your son and my son are walking down the street holding hands. I mean, imagine that day. Imagine the picture, that mental imagery of that picture of them walking down the street and what that would feel like. And for a lot of detainees, this would move them to tears to think that's what their country could be. Where does that technique come from? Sports psychology. Anybody here ever heard about athletes imagining a shot before they take it, before a competition? Musicians use it. All types of professionals. It comes from sports psychology. There's tons of ways we can use emotions to our advantage and adapt techniques from outside of interrogations to help us be successful, and they're all non-coercive and ethical. The last thing I want to say is we have to improve our culture. Right now, in the past, I'd say in the past, we're at culture minus 1.0. What I mean by that, not only did we not get the culture right, but we got it exactly wrong. I heard people say this is a culture of violence and all they understand is violence. Anybody ever heard that? It's in an email from the highest ranking person ever convicted since 9/11 of torture, a chief warrant officer, to his commanding officer. Those types of stereotypes set us so far back in the world of interrogations and just in the war. It just can't be overstated. Now we're up to culture 1.0, which is you go up to a soldier and say, what's the difference between a Sunni and a Shia, and he'll tell you. You ask him, when was Muhammad born? He'll tell you. What's Ramadan? What are the tenets of Islam? What are some social habits you shouldn't do? You shouldn't point the soles of your feet at somebody. That's great. I mean, that's great if you're a tourist and you want to go backpacking through Iraq. But if you want to interrogate, you need to be at culture 3.0. You need to be at the point where you understand their culture so well that you understand the types of things you can influence so that their culture adds to the persuasion that you're using to convince them to cooperate. That's where we need to be. The final thing I'm going to say is that we have everything we need to be great interrogators and be successful because it's in our culture. Everything it takes to be a great American is what it takes to be a great interrogator. It's based on compassion. It's based on cultural understanding. It's based on intellect and innovation. And it's based on being human. Thank you. Okay, let me start with the first question, which is not an easy one. The question is, it's referring to the name of the subtitle of my book, which is Take Down the Deadliest Man in Iraq. And it says, Take Down the Deadliest Man in Iraq is a euphemism for extrajudicial execution. Your work led to an assassination without trial plus deaths of civilians. Why is that a good thing? So it's a good question. I think it's a debate we should have. But it's the difference between combat operations and counterinsurgency and what would be law enforcement operations. So if you believe that the period after the initial invasion of Iraq if you believe that the reasons to go to war in Iraq were legal, and if you believe that it was a legal war, and that after the war was completed, we were doing counterinsurgency ops or stabilization operations, however you want to phrase it, then you can say that within the laws of war, we're still conducting combat operations, that you can shoot and kill people to defend yourself or to defend yourself. Now, the other argument that people are going to make is that combat operations ended in Iraq, and that when combat ended, the counterinsurgency should have been law enforcement operations. Now, I'm the first person to say I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not an expert in international humanitarian law. So I can't answer that question from a legal perspective. I try very hard to stay in my lane, which is interrogations. And I try to say that when I get a question that pertains to the law, we should ask lawyers. Or we should ask people who have made a career out of international humanitarian law. We shouldn't ask interrogators. And this is one of the problems also that we saw with detainee abuse, is that in a lot of times the directions on interrogation methods was very unclear. And so even the guidance, the legal guidance to interrogators was unclear on what was legal and not legal. And when they authorized enhanced interrogation techniques, which is just a euphemism for torture and abuse in my opinion, we made the entire system unclear. Why? Because, the Army Field Manual clearly says that cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment is illegal. So how can you have a manual that says that's illegal and then another guidance that says it is? It ends up corrupting the entire system, because now people don't believe anything in the manual if that's not true. Not to even talk about the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So in this question, what I say is, it's probably a question for lawyers about whether or not once you finish combat operations and you're conducting counterinsurgency, if you have to conduct those operations according to justice or law enforcement rules in the law, or do you have some type of, is it still military combat, and do the laws of armed conflict still apply? The other part of this was the deaths of civilians. The deaths of civilians is never a good thing. My biggest regret, honestly, is the deaths of civilians in Iraq that were civilian casualties. I would have perhaps made a different decision than our commander in certain operations in which civilians were killed, because I personally believe that we as soldiers have the obligation to take the risk, even if it endangers our lives, to save civilian lives. I think the policy has changed in Afghanistan now, because we understand that winning the hearts and minds is more important than killing people. Something that many of us recognized before we ever went into Iraq. If you're interested, you can read a book called The Ugly Americans, which came out in the 1950s, which John F. Kennedy, when he was a senator, gave to every other senator. And in The Ugly Americans, all of this has already been written. It was written during a time when we saw Vietnam coming and when we were battling communist insurgency in the Philippines, and all the arguments that people are making today about what we need to be doing in Afghanistan are in that book. These aren't new. These aren't new concepts about defending populations and about protecting civilians. Next question. Okay, here's a good one. Since you incorporate knowledge from many fields in your technique, what educational backgrounds help prepare you for the job as an interrogator? None. Well, I should take that back. Maybe there's some. My best preparation for being an interrogator was traveling. Why? Because it exposed me to other cultures and people that aren't like me, and made me realize that everybody's an individual, and that results in uniqueness. And so I should never stereotype people, regardless of their culture or where they come from. And that is the most important step in every interrogation, is that first step of building rapport and analyzing what motivates someone. Take a guess how many people I met in Iraq who had joined Al-Qaeda for religion. 0. 0. Analyzing people and understanding why they joined Al-Qaeda was absolutely fundamental to convincing them to cooperate, because you had to identify what was their primary motivation. If it was money, then maybe you had to make an economic incentive. If it was social status, then maybe you did a pride and ego up approach that appealed to their sense of self-worth. You had to first identify what made them join Al-Qaeda in the first place. And we skipped that step. Because the commanding general in Iraq, General Casey, came to my prison when I was there, and he asked for a briefing on how close we were to finding Zarqawi, and the intelligence officer gave him the briefing, and afterwards General Casey had one question. He said, "Why do they join?" And the intelligence officer gave the standard reply that we all heard a million times after 9/11, which is Al-Qaeda hates our culture, and they want to reestablish the caliphate, and they want to impose Sharia law. That's a bunch of BS. There might be some people who believe in that, but I haven't met them or heard of them. And Osama bin Laden might certainly believe in that, although even he states his reasons aren't those necessarily. It has to do with U.S. policies in the Middle East, has to do with support for dictatorships in the Middle East. But the point is that we skipped that step. People in Iraq were joining for a variety of reasons. I stood up and I said, "General Casey, sir, I disagree. I've never heard that. There's a lot of reasons why people are joining. Some are social, some are economic, some are protection from Shia militias that were allowed to run free, something that Donald Rumsfeld once said was just a little blowing off of steam. Trust me, when you have your brother or your sister or your father murdered by a Shia militia, you don't consider it somebody blowing off steam. So there was a variety of reasons why people joined Al-Qaeda, and what allowed me to see that in people, I think, was my exposure to a variety of cultures that made me appreciate all of them. This will be a quick answer. Have your words, like the ones you spoke tonight, made it to Obama's ears? Without a doubt. How do I know that? Because some of his speeches have adopted language that I've put into op-eds, and there's only been in fact, I'm the first person to talk about firsthand witnessing the recruitment, the fact that the policy of torture and recruitment not only just recruited foreign fighters, but that led to the deaths of Americans. And that's become, I think, a cornerstone of the argument, of one of the cornerstone arguments against torture and abuse. Do you speak Arabic? Lala. No, I don't. Let me talk about that. So you'll hear time and time again people say that interrogators, we need to train more people in the language. That's great. I wish we could do that. But I can tell you that it's an unrealistic objective to think that we're going to train 3,000 interrogators in Arabic. I had interrogators on my team who were trained Arabic linguists. They could pass the test with flying colors. They couldn't interrogate in Arabic. Why? Because there's 14 dialects of Arabic in Iraq. Imagine something as nuanced as interrogation, where you're trying to use very specific terms and get very precise information. It's almost impossible. We only had one guy that I remember that ever interrogated in Arabic, and it was because he had grown up in Lebanon. The interpreters were absolutely crucial and vital for us to be able to accomplish our mission. Now, if I had a choice between an interpreter and a Muslim American that I could train to be an interrogator, I'd rather take the Muslim American interrogator who's fluent in the language and knows the culture. But we haven't done that. We haven't recruited those people. Instead, I had interpreters who just saved my butt day in and day out. And I feel like I'm fairly well versed in the culture, but all the time they would come to my rescue when I missed something that would go over my head. Let me give you a perfect example. I was interrogating this guy. He was 60 years old. I was asking him, I remember that Van Gogh technique I was telling you about, where I paint a picture in their mind? I told him to close his eyes and imagine the day when he goes home to his wife. He gets out of prison, he walks in the door, he opens it up, walks in, and he sees his wife's face. Imagine the look on her face. And I opened my eyes and peeked at him, and he was just staring at me with a blank look. And I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Which wife should I be thinking of?" I said, "You have two wives?" He said, "Yeah." I said, well, who's your second wife? He goes, well, we just got married last year. I said, how old is she? He said, she's 20. Now I heard it, right? This is our reaction, right? 60-year-old guy, 20-year-old wife. I know what I thought about why he got married a second time. After the interrogation, my interpreter pulled me outside, and he said, hey, you realize why he got married a second time? I said, yeah, I think I figured that out. And he said, no. Remember a long time ago you asked him about his son? He said he has a son who's been married for 10 years, and he hasn't had kids. Either him or his wife is unable to have kids. He married a second wife to have another son to continue his bloodline. That piece of information was absolutely key in convincing him to cooperate. It's a story I tell in my book. I never picked up on it, but my interpreter did because he's from Iraq. So I don't speak Arabic, but it never hindered me from doing an interrogation because I had good interpreters who understood the culture and who would educate me on it. Why would I want to pull that resource? I mean, you can teach me Arabic for 10 years, and I'll never have the knowledge of that person who's grown up in the culture. I'd rather have them in the room, and I'd never want to pull them out. Now, there's a difference, for instance, like in World War II, where we had first-generation Japanese Americans interrogating who are obviously well-versed in the culture, or someone like Sherwood Moran, who I mentioned, who had worked in Japan for 20 years. But I would prefer to have interpreters. What happened to your detainees after you interrogated them? They would go to one of the permanent prisons. For instance, Abu Ghraib was closed. Camp Cropper or Camp Bucca. And then what would happen is, after they go through intelligence interrogations, they're turned over to the criminal system, which in Iraq at the time, they would first go before a panel, usually pretty quickly, within a week or so, that would determine whether or not you had enough evidence to hold them. And if that panel decided, yes, you did, then they went to one of the prisons, and they were held till they could see this, till they go before a court. And the court was 3 judges, 1 Sunni, 1 Shia, and 1 American. And they would decide guilt, and they would sentence people. I can tell you that probably, I never saw what happened to my detainees, because by the time that all that happened, I was long gone, which was true for everybody. Plus, you just didn't get the news. It wasn't passed back to you. But occasionally, like there was one guy who had come through my task force who had been behind a lot of the suicide bombings who went before the court, and he was sentenced to death. And I can tell you the court had very little sympathy for people behind suicide bombings that were targeting civilians. But they did give them leniency if they cooperated, I can say that. What did Jon Stewart say to you right before the commercial break when you appeared on The Daily Show? I don't remember. I can say this. I thought he phrased it perfectly when he said that nothing more than our national soul is at stake in this debate. And I thought that was a very eloquent way to say it. Have you interrogated Shia who were suspected of terrorism? If yes, what difference you found between them and al-Qaeda members? The answer to that is no. When I was in Iraq in 2006, we weren't even arresting Shia. At least my task force wasn't, because our mission was solely to find Zarqawi, who was, the leader of al-Qaeda, which was all Sunni. I can tell you a story of when I was, it's going to be in my next book. It's a shameless promotion, by the way. It will be out in January. It's all about that last month on the raid team and doing interrogations in the field. And I can tell you that there was a time when we captured a guy, and my interpreter and I were staying there. I was interrogating him, and maybe a minute into the interrogation, my interpreter stopped me and said, "This guy's Shia." And I was like, "How do you know that?" He said, "By the clock on the wall," because we were in his home. And I looked up at the clock, and it just had this oil painting in the background of the clock face. And he said, no Sunni would ever have that clock in his house. And it was a saint within Shia religion. And my interpreter knew it right away, and he was right. It turned out that we had captured the chief of police, which was a little bit embarrassing. He was working undercover. Obviously, it was a good cover. At the beginning, you mentioned interrogating twins, but then switched to the hierarchy of sibling relationships of older and younger brothers. Can you clarify this for me? So if you ever do culture studies, there's a guy named Gert Hofstede, who's German, who did these comparisons of culture and ranked them. And there's been a lot of controversy about this, but he basically said some cultures are stronger in certain types of cultural phenomena, if you will, than others. And so, for instance, in America, I think it's pretty clear that we're fairly independent people. We don't have high confrontation avoidance, meaning that we're not afraid to argue with people or raise our voice. In the Middle East, it's fairly hierarchical. In other words, it's rare to find somebody challenging somebody in a position higher than them. In fact, another great interrogation technique, if you understand the culture, refers to the term wasta, which is a term in Arabic which means power or influence, basically, from one's position. And so a tribal leader, a tribal sheikh would have a lot of wasta because they'd be able to get things done. And so there's this hierarchical nature in their society that's not that we don't have that, because we do, but it's more prominent over there. And so in this case, we believed that the younger brother, the one who was born second, who would take a role, a secondary role to the brother who was born first, would defer to anything that the older brother said. And so not only were we using a law enforcement technique, but it was well adapted to the culture because of that hierarchical difference between the one that was born first and thought of as the older brother and the responsible one, and the younger brother and his unwillingness to contradict something he thought his older brother said. I want to mention something else that reminded me of. So I talked a lot about the negative stereotypes of Islam and about the religion, but I want to talk a little bit more about the positive ones. I've written this unofficial interrogation manual that I share with interrogators. And one part of it is law enforcement techniques, and another big part of it is culture, but it's Arab and Muslim culture from a positive point of view. And what do I mean by that? Well, to give you an example, consider the idea of mercy. So the first line of the Quran is, "Praise be to Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful." That's the first line before every chapter in the Quran. Now consider the power of that statement. In the Middle East, and especially in Iraq, the concept of mercy towards one's enemies is highly respected. There's a famous story during the Third Crusade. Richard the Lionheart was defeated in the Third Crusade by a Kurdish Iraqi named Salah ad-Din. And Salah ad-Din, during one of the battles, captured a key commander or lieutenant of Richard Lionheart, a guy named Guy de Lusson. And he certainly could have killed Guy de Lusson, but instead he spared his life. And this is a story almost every Iraqi knows, because it's an amazing story about the compassion of a leader towards an enemy. And in fact, in Iraq, if your enemy comes to your house to negotiate and you invite him in, or you're obligated to invite him in, you are now obligated to protect him with your life. And your honor rests on that. If he were to be killed, you would be completely disgraced, and you would lose your honor. Consider detainee abuse in that context, what it means. How everybody viewed us when we failed to honor that type of commitment, that type of obligation. And so there's this theme within Islam that I believe is the most prominent, which is one of mercy and compassion. And we can use that in interrogation when we show people mercy and compassion, because it fits right into an idea of reciprocity. If I show the detainee mercy and compassion, and he's my guest, now he's honor-bound to return that. And that's a strong way to use the culture again, a positive view of the culture, to convince people to cooperate and to work together. Next question. Since both the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were illegal under international law, wasn't all of your activity illegal? When was war officially declared on Iraq? Well, I don't know the answer to the last one. I don't know, it was in March, I think. Let me say this. That's a difficult question to answer because, one, I was in Saudi Arabia at the beginning of the war. I was running a detachment of agents doing counterterrorism to protect our largest air base. So I was there at the beginning of the war. I wasn't in favor of the war for a lot of reasons. One, I thought it had nothing to do with 9/11. I never believed that WMD, even if Saddam had had it, would have been an excuse to go to war. There's other countries like North Korea that have WMD that we haven't invaded and have also committed terrorist acts. If we use that as a justification, we'd have a lot more wars. But as a soldier, this is a difficult choice. And obviously some soldiers have decided not to go to war and have refused orders to go to war because they felt that the war in Iraq was an illegal one. I won't criticize them or fault them, but I'll just say my perspective and the reason I volunteered, because I did volunteer both times to go, is because I felt that I could be an agent of change from the inside. And this also goes to the fact that there's things going on in my task force when I arrived, instances of detainee abuse or of people who were bending or breaking the rules that I stopped. I wouldn't allow my team to do any of those things, not that any of them would have. But I decided not to go outside the unit with that. I went to the commander, but I didn't go outside the unit. I didn't quit. I didn't walk away. And this goes to the reason why you won't read about detainee abuse in my book either. It's because I don't think you fix something by pointing out that it's broken. I think you fix it by coming up with something better. And so I felt it was my obligation to try and make it better as an officer, and that was my professional duty. And so what I taught my team was a better way to do interrogations within the law. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is because I wanted Americans to know that, hey, in 2006, Zarqawi was a higher priority than Osama bin Laden. And we successfully found him using non-coercive techniques, and we did it by improving the methods. So that was my choice.
Can I have a very short follow-up since I asked that very quickly?
Sure.
It sounds to me, I'm in my mid-50s, I had a 1A draft card, which fortunately I never had to face because the draft ended. I had a 1A draft card when we were doing the illegal war in Vietnam. What it sounds like to me that you're saying is what was refuted during the Nuremberg tribunals and what became the Nuremberg Convention, which is you're saying you were just following orders, and hasn't it been established that that's not a defense?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I've made that argument about detainee abuse, which is that Nuremberg clearly showed that following unlawful orders is not a reason to commit abuse. And we've reversed Nuremberg to this point because we've refused to acknowledge that that's true and prosecute people. That said, detainee abuse was so widespread, I don't think that it's even possible logistically to go after everybody who committed abuse, and I personally feel like we should just go after the top. In terms of the order to go to war, that's a tricky question. I didn't feel so strongly opposed to it that I felt like I should disobey, that it was an unlawful order. But that was my decision. I don't fault anybody who did feel that way, because I can understand why they did. As a soldier, I think we have to kind of be careful, I do think, in some respects. We have to respect the fact that there might be things we don't like that we have to do. Our training teaches us to draw the line at legality where there's a clear violation of the law. And I think detainee abuse was the clear violation of the law. The order to go to war, what I would say is if we want to fix that, there's two things we can do. The first is we should not be allowed to declare war without a draft. That's my personal feeling. We have completely eluded the social responsibility of all citizens in the United States by having an all-volunteer force. It's too easy to be complacent about the decision to go to war because it's not you that has to go, or it's not someone else that has to go. It's not your brother, it's not your sister who's going to get the draft card. So I think if we want to bring back a more clear decision about the legality of war and the decision to go to war, we should bring back the draft for all wars. Now, obviously, we're going to have a debate about what's a war and what's a conflict and what's declared war. But the other thing I think we need to talk about is what information is shared with the public. So if you truly believe that there was WMD in Iraq, and that's what we were told, and you believe that that was a legal justification to go to war, then you could say you believe the order was lawful. But what if the public had the knowledge that that was a lie beforehand? I have a colleague who's a fellow who worked at the CIA as an analyst at the time and was writing the daily intelligence briefs for the president. And she's writing a book about what do we do about this dilemma about the public having full information about the decision to go to war and our need to keep operational secrets. And so I think that's a bigger debate. Is there an interrogation in Iraq in which you wish you could do over? If so, what it was? Yes, without a doubt. Let me say you can do an ethical, you can do a legal interrogation that's non-coercive and have regrets. I have interrogations that I feel bad about that I did as a criminal investigator. The perfect example was a case I had once. It was a rape allegation. We had clear evidence that it was a false allegation, including videotape of somebody staging a scene. But our rules and laws required us to interrogate because we have to follow every loose end to ensure that this was a false allegation. If you don't go in there and interrogate the suspect to your full ability, people are always going to wonder, could this person have been innocent? I mean, guilty, but you didn't try hard enough. And lo and behold, this has happened to us. We had a case that was ruled a suicide. We didn't follow the leads because it looked so obvious, and we didn't want to put the family through a comprehensive investigation. It turned out it was a homicide. So it's for law enforcement, and I'm going to apply this to intelligence interrogations, you have to go through all the steps, and you have to do a thorough interrogation. And sometimes those interrogations are emotionally challenging. I can tell you, if you're ever falsely accused of something, it's going to be an emotional ordeal for you to be interrogated, even if you had nothing to do with it. It's going to be stressful. Interrogators are going to use techniques on you that you might even probably, depending on how they do it and what you're accused of, you might even experience post-traumatic stress disorder. I put detainees through very emotional interrogations in Iraq, one of which I regret, not because it was unethical, but because the guy was innocent. There's a good book by Nancy Sherman called The Untold War, which talks about the costs and the costs on soldiers when they do the right thing, just because it's war. She talks about things like guilt over people who are killed. You know, what if you're supposed to go out on a mission and you have somebody else take your place and they go out and they get killed? And she also interviews an interrogator, and he talked about the fact that we often deceive detainees. And we do. Deception is part of warfare. You know, nobody would say that we don't have the right, if we're conducting a land war, to fake an attack on the left and go on the right. Deception is part of warfare, and it is part of an interrogation. And so there was one guy in particular that I talk about in my book who I put through a very emotional interrogation, and it turned out he was innocent. But I think the important part is the apology. They sent over somebody from Civil Affairs, because this guy was a journalist, to apologize to him and to make amends. And I said, hell no, I'm going back in there, and I'm giving the apology. And I did so, and the guy surprisingly said to me, I would have done the same thing. You know, one of my best friends was killed by Al-Qaeda, and I understand the difficult position you're in. And although it was a very difficult interrogation, I'm glad that you didn't torture me, you didn't abuse me. So, do we have time for one more? Okay. Did you ever feel your techniques were not working? How did you overcome? So there was one case in Iraq where we captured this guy who was a leader of a kidnapping cell. He was purely in it for just the profit. They would set up roadblocks on the highway, they'd capture these truckers, take them back to a house, hold them for ransom, and then when the companies paid the ransom, they would take the victims out back and shoot them and kill them. In one case, I think they decapitated a guy. And we raided this house, and we captured the leader of the cell and a couple of his men and one of the victims. So I went in and I interviewed the victim, and he told me this whole story. He had been held for 6 months. He'd been tortured routinely. And then I went next door and interrogated the man who was the head of the cell and had done all this. Again, talk about emotionally challenging to hold your feelings intact. But this guy I call the Rock because he never talked. I mean, he literally never talked. He never said one word. He sat there and never said a word. I interrogated him for 3-4 hours a day for probably a week. But it was in one of those interrogations that I learned how to make him cry. I learned how to perfect the technique that I told you about called the Van Gogh, which was the imagery that I could bring up to get an emotional response out of him. So what did I learn from that? That our failures are opportunities to improve. And you know, as many an experienced interrogator will tell you, there's nobody who bats 1,000%. You're going to fail. There's going to be people who never talk and techniques don't work on. You know what? Every second you worry about that guy and trying to figure that out, you're wasting that you could be spending on someone else who will talk. No cell is a one man. And so you move on. You learn from it, you advance your techniques, and then you get better at them, and you apply those to other people. And it turns out that for me, the technique that I developed in that interrogation that I perfected, I used on the detainee that told us how to find Zarqawi. So, I think that's it.
All right, let's give another round of applause, Matthew.